A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
We are diving into a topic today that has been the absolute center of gravity for Israeli politics for months now, and, honestly, for the last few years. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the Haredi sector in Israel, specifically the ultra-orthodox community, and the massive tensions surrounding their role in the state. We are looking at the draft, the money, the demographics, and whether the current social contract in Israel can actually hold together under the weight of these numbers.
It is the single biggest threat to the coalition's stability right now. My name is Herman Poppleberry, and I have been staring at the 2026 budget numbers all morning because they tell the real story. We are currently navigating this 80,000-man draft impasse that is essentially a political landmine. It is not just about religious lifestyle anymore. It is about the fact that Israel is in the middle of a massive security crunch following years of conflict, and the math simply does not add up if a huge chunk of the population stays on the sidelines. We are at a point where the state can no longer afford to treat this as a niche minority issue.
It feels like the conversation has shifted. For decades, the secular resentment was there, but it was almost like a background noise, right? Now, with the war costs and the reserve duty being extended over and over, that resentment has turned into a full-blown legislative crisis. Daniel wants us to look at the facts behind the friction. Let's start with the basics, because people often treat the Haredim as this monolithic block of people who all think the same way. But that is not really the case, is it?
Not at all. When we talk about the Haredi community, which is about 12.5% of the total population right now, we are looking at roughly 1.26 million people. But you have to distinguish between the three main political and social pillars to understand why the Knesset looks the way it does. First, you have the Lithuanians, represented by the Degel HaTorah party. They are the intellectualists, focused heavily on the prestige of yeshiva study. Then you have the Hasidic groups, represented by Agudat Yisrael. They are more communal, organized around dynastic rebbes, and often more insular. Together, they form the United Torah Judaism bloc, which currently holds 7 seats.
And then there is Shas, which always seems to be the real power player in these coalitions.
Shas represents the Sephardic or Mizrahi ultra-orthodox. They hold 11 seats, making them the heavyweights. Those groups have very different views on the state and very different political priorities. Shas, for example, is much more integrated in many ways than the Ashkenazi factions in United Torah Judaism. They have a massive social services network and a voter base that includes many people who are not strictly Haredi but are traditionally religious. Aryeh Deri, who leads Shas, is arguably one of the most experienced political operators in the history of the Knesset. He is not looking to dismantle the state. He is looking to ensure his constituents have the resources and the autonomy they need to maintain their way of life. But even for a pragmatist like Deri, the current pressure is unprecedented.
And that way of life is under a microscope because of the June 2024 Supreme Court ruling. That was the moment the High Court basically said that blanket exemptions for yeshiva students are illegal. Since then, the government has been playing this high-stakes game of legislative musical chairs.
The court basically upended 80 years of policy. You have to remember this started with David Ben-Gurion in 1948. He gave exemptions to about 400 Holocaust survivors to rebuild the world of Torah study that was destroyed in Europe. Fast forward to today, and that 400 has turned into 80,000 draft-eligible men who are not serving. The IDF is being very vocal right now. They say they need 12,000 new recruits immediately just to maintain operational readiness and relieve the burden on reservists who have been deployed multiple times since 2023. So when the coalition tries to pass a draft exemption bill here in early 2026 that doesn't actually result in more boots on the ground, the military and the finance ministry are both saying it is a non-starter.
Is that why Shas was threatening to blow up the 2026 budget? I saw the headlines about them holding the entire state budget hostage unless the draft bill passed first. That is a massive gamble when you have the Iran war costs putting a squeeze on everything.
It was a total standoff. In the last few weeks, Netanyahu and the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, eventually had to convince the religious parties to set the draft bill aside just to get the budget through. They basically argued that the country literally could not afford a government collapse in the middle of a war crunch. But that is just a temporary fix. The underlying issue is what I call the draft or work paradox. This is the part that really grinds the gears of the secular public and the economists at the Israel Democracy Institute. Under the current system, if a Haredi man wants to keep his draft exemption, he has to stay in the yeshiva. If he leaves to go get a job, he loses the exemption and becomes draft eligible. So the state is essentially paying people to stay out of the workforce.
It is a perverse incentive structure. You are literally subsidizing people to not contribute to the tax base and to not serve in the military. And we are not talking about pennies here. The 2026 budget included over $700 million in earmarked funds specifically for ultra-orthodox institutions.
It is actually $715 million, or over 2.5 billion shekels to be exact. And that is part of a larger 5 billion shekel package of coalition funds. When you look at the employment data, the picture is really startling. Haredi male employment is stuck at around 54%. Compare that to non-Haredi Jewish men who are at 85%, and the income gap is even wider. The average Haredi man earns about 9,929 shekels a month, which is only 49% of the 20,464 shekels earned by a mainstream Jewish man. So you have a sector that is 12.5% of the population, but contributes a much, much smaller fraction of the income tax and social insurance.
But there is a flip side to that economic story that people often miss, and I think it is important for the nuance Daniel asked for. What about the women? Because every time I see the data, the Haredi women seem to be the ones keeping the lights on.
The Haredi women are the absolute economic engine of that community. Their employment rate is 80%. That is almost identical to the non-Haredi Jewish female rate, which is about 83%. It is a very deliberate communal model where the women work in high-tech, education, or administration so the men can study. So the narrative that they do not contribute at all is factually wrong. They contribute significantly, but it is lopsided. And because they have much larger families, the household income is still stretched incredibly thin. A Haredi household is typically 1.5 times larger than a secular one, but they pay about 1/3 of the taxes. This model worked when the community was 5% of the population back in 1990, but at 12.5% and growing, the strain on the national treasury is becoming a structural risk.
So you have this demographic trajectory that looks like a steep climb. If the Haredi population is 12.5% now, what does 2050 look like? I have heard the term demographic time bomb used a lot, which sounds a bit alarmist, but the numbers are the numbers.
The projections from the National Economic Council are pretty clear. By 2030, they will be 16%. By 2033, we are looking at 2 million people, and by 2050, we are looking at 24%. That means 1 in 4 Israelis will be Haredi. If the employment and military service patterns do not change, the math for a modern, high-tech Western economy basically breaks. You cannot sustain a first-world military and a first-world welfare state if 25% of your population is largely opting out of those systems. The fertility rate is a big driver here. Even though it is at a 43-year low of 6.1 children per woman, it is still massive compared to the 2.4 for non-Haredi Jewish women.
Does that mean they want to turn Israel into a theocracy? That is the big fear you hear at the protests in Tel Aviv. People are worried that as the numbers shift, the Haredi parties will move from just wanting autonomy to wanting to impose Jewish law, or halacha, on everyone.
That is a common misconception that needs some debunking. If you look at the actual legislative record of Shas and United Torah Judaism, they are not really interested in a theocratic takeover of secular Tel Aviv. They are interested in what we call cultural autonomy. They want their own schools, their own neighborhoods, and the ability to live their lives without state interference. Their political power is used as a shield, not a sword. They want the funding and the exemptions to keep their walls high. Now, there are religious Zionist groups like those led by Smotrich or Ben-Gvir who have more of a vision for a state governed by religious law, but the Haredi leadership knows that if they push too hard on the secular public, they risk breaking the very state that provides the infrastructure they rely on.
Speaking of fringe groups, Daniel mentioned the ones who are openly antagonistic to the state. We saw those raids in Mea Shearim in early 25, where the police found Palestinian flags and anti-Zionist posters. And then there was that incident where Ben Gvir was attacked in Beit Shemesh. Who are these people? Because for an outsider, it looks crazy to see a Haredi person waving a Palestinian flag.
Those are groups like Neturei Karta. The name means guardians of the city in Aramaic. They are a tiny, tiny fringe. We are talking maybe a few thousand people in a community of over 1 million. Their theology is that a Jewish state cannot exist until the Messiah arrives, so they view the modern state of Israel as a rebellion against God. They are very loud and very good at getting media attention, but they are viewed as extremists even within the Haredi world. In February 2025, the police raid on that warehouse in Mea Shearim was a big deal because it showed how deep that anti-state sentiment goes in those specific pockets. But most Haredim are what we would call non-Zionist rather than anti-Zionist. They do not celebrate Independence Day with fireworks, but they use the Israeli healthcare system, they vote in the elections, and they are deeply invested in the safety of the land.
It is funny you mention Ben Gvir because he is on the far right, but he is not Haredi. He is religious Zionist. And yet, he is the one getting stun grenades thrown at him by the anti-Zionist Haredim in Beit Shemesh back in May of 2025. It shows how many layers there are to this. You have the secular religious divide, but you also have these intense internal religious divides.
The religious Zionist community actually serves in the army at very high rates. They are often the elite officers and commanders now, so they actually have a lot of tension with the Haredim over the draft issue. Even within the right-wing coalition, there is a massive rift because the religious Zionists feel like they are carrying the burden of the defense while the Haredim are getting a free pass. That is why the draft bill is so poisonous. It is not just the left and the center complaining. It is the core of the right-wing base that is starting to say, wait a minute, why are my sons fighting in Gaza and Lebanon while yours are staying in the study hall? We even saw a Haredi politician face massive backlash in March 2025 just for being filmed dancing to an anti-Zionist anthem. The tolerance for that kind of thing is at an all-time low.
That war effect is something we should stay on for a second. Before October 2023, the draft issue was a slow simmering problem. After the war started, and especially now in 2026, it has become a visceral, emotional wound for families. When you are on your 3rd or 4th round of reserve duty, and you are seeing the economic impact on your own business, seeing a budget that earmarks hundreds of millions for people who are not sharing that burden, it changes the conversation from a policy debate to a survival debate.
The IDF's need for 12,000 recruits is not a theoretical number. It is based on the reality of holding territory and defending borders. When the High Court says the exemptions are illegal, they are looking at the principle of equality before the law. But the government is looking at coalition survival. Netanyahu knows that if he forces the Haredim into the army, Shas and United Torah Judaism will walk. If they walk, the government falls, and we go to elections. In the current climate, Netanyahu likely loses those elections, so he is trapped between the legal and military reality on one side and his political survival on the other. This is why we saw United Torah Judaism briefly threaten to exit the coalition in July 2025. They know they are the kingmakers.
It is a classic immovable object, meeting an unstoppable force. But let's talk about the younger generation of Haredim. Are we seeing any movement there? Because I have heard that there is a growing number of young Haredi men who actually want to work or even serve, but they are afraid of being ostracized by their community.
There is a massive internal shift happening, but it is quiet. You have what people call the modern Haredim. These are people who still keep the commandments and identify as ultra-orthodox, but they are getting degrees in computer science or accounting. They are entering the workforce because the cost of living in Israel is simply too high to survive on a yeshiva stipend and a wife's salary alone. There were some really interesting numbers from 2025 showing a spike in Haredi men enrolling in vocational programs. The problem is that the official leadership, the rabbis and the politicians like Moshe Gafni and Yitzhak Goldknopf, are terrified that if they bless this transition, they will lose control over the community. They see the army and the secular workforce as melting pots that will turn their youth into secular Israelis.
It is a fear of dilution. If you go into the army, you are exposed to different ideas, different people, and a different lifestyle. For a community that has survived for centuries by building walls, the IDF is the ultimate wall breaker.
That is exactly their perspective. They view Torah study as the spiritual shield of the nation. To them, the guy sitting in a room in Jerusalem studying the Talmud is doing as much for the security of Israel as the guy in a tank. Now, most Israelis find that argument infuriating, but you have to understand that they genuinely believe it. It is not an excuse to them, it is a fundamental truth of their existence. So when you tell them they have to go to the draft office, they see it as a decree against their religion, not just a civic duty.
So, how do we bridge that? Because the demographic trend we talked about earlier, 1 in 4 by 2050, suggests that the walls are going to have to come down eventually, whether they want them to or not. You cannot have 25% of a country living in a self-imposed bubble if that bubble is being funded by the other 75%.
The path forward is likely through the economy rather than the military, at least initially. If you can decouple the draft from the right to work, you might see a massive influx of Haredi men into the economy. Right now, as I said, they are trapped. If they work, they get drafted. If we change the law to say, okay, you do not have to serve, but you must work and pay taxes, you might actually solve the economic crisis even if you do not solve the military one. But that is a hard pill for the secular public to swallow because it feels like giving in to inequality. It is the ultimate pragmatism versus principle debate.
We actually touched on some of these demographic shifts in episode 1247 when we talked about the Elia paradox. The way the population is changing is not just about who is coming into the country, but who is being born here and how they are being integrated. That episode is a great companion to this because it looks at the broader picture of how Israel's identity is shifting.
The Haredi community is the most visible part of that shift. When you look at the 2026 inflection point we are in right now, the government has to decide what it prioritizes. Is it the budget? Is it the draft? Or is it just keeping the lights on for another week? The Shas party holding the budget hostage was a wake-up call. It showed that the Haredi parties know exactly how much leverage they have, and they are not afraid to use it, even when the country is facing an existential threat.
It makes me wonder about the social contract. In any other country, if 12% of the population was exempt from the most basic national duty and was subsidized by everyone else, you would have a revolution. In Israel, it has been managed through this complex system of coalition politics, but it feels like the rubber is finally hitting the road.
The social contract is fraying. That is the only way to put it. You have the people who pay the taxes and do the fighting, and they are looking at the people who do neither, and they are saying the deal is off. But the Haredim are looking back and saying, we are the ones who are preserving the Jewish soul of this state, and if you force us to change, you are destroying the reason we are here in the first place. It is two completely different visions of what a Jewish state is supposed to be. One is a modern, democratic, sovereign nation state. The other is a spiritual community that happens to live in its ancestral homeland.
And the government's reaction to the extremists, like the Neturei Karta, seems to be getting tougher. Those raids in Mea Shearim and the use of stun grenades in Beit Shemesh suggest that even a right-wing government has its limits when it comes to open antagonism against the state.
Even Ben-Gvir, who is as hardline as they come, cannot tolerate people waving Palestinian flags in the heart of Jerusalem. But the government has to be careful. If they go too hard on the fringes, they risk radicalizing the mainstream. Most Haredim looked at those Beit Shemesh clashes with a lot of discomfort. They do not like the extremists, but they also do not like the police coming into their neighborhoods with stun grenades. It is a very delicate balance. Aryeh Derai and the Shah's leadership are constantly trying to keep the temperature down because they know that chaos only helps the people who want to dismantle the whole system.
Let's talk about the takeaways here. If someone is looking at Israel in 2026 and trying to figure out where this goes, what should they be watching for? To me, the move from exemption to integration seems inevitable, but the pace is the problem. The IDF needs 12,000 people now, not in 20 years.
The first takeaway is that the status quo is mathematically dead. Whether it is through a court order or economic collapse, the model of blanket exemptions for tens of thousands of men is over. The second takeaway is that the women-first economic model is something we should actually be studying and supporting. If we can get Haredi men to enter the workforce at even half the rate that Haredi women have, the economic outlook for Israel changes overnight. We need to focus on incentivizing work without necessarily making it a war over religion.
And the third takeaway is probably that the theocracy fear is likely overblown, but the autonomy issue is real. The Haredi community is going to remain a distinct, powerful sector of Israeli society. They aren't going to become secular liberals just because they start working at a tech company or serving in a search and rescue unit. Israel is becoming a more religious country, and the secular public has to find a way to live with that, just as the religious public has to find a way to contribute to the state's survival.
It is about reconciling these two distinct populations. If they cannot find a way to share the burden, the social contract will not just fray, it will snap. And in a neighborhood like this, with the threats Israel faces in 2026, an internal snap is the one thing the country cannot afford. The survival of the Zionist project literally depends on solving this Haredi integration puzzle.
It is a wild situation. You have a high-tech superpower that is also home to one of the most traditional, conservative religious communities in the world, and they are locked in this embrace where they both need each other but can't agree on the rules. Daniel really hit on the core tension of modern Israel with this one.
It is the ultimate weird prompt because the deeper you go, the more you realize that every simple solution has a massive downside. You want to draft them all tomorrow? You risk a civil war and a total breakdown of the community. You want to keep the status quo? You risk economic ruin and a military that is too small for its mission. The answer is somewhere in the messy middle, and that is where the politics are happening right now.
Well, I think we have covered the ground on this one. It is a lot of data, a lot of history, and a lot of very high stakes.
It is the reality of the 2026 inflection point. We will see if the government prioritizes the budget or the draft in the next round of negotiations.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping us on track, and a big thanks to Modell for providing the GPU credits that power this show. This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying these deep dives, you can find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe.
We will be back next time with whatever Daniel throws our way.
See ya!
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the close from sloth.